be here. I will tell you, I was 3 minutes ago facilitating my board of advisors meeting down there. So some of them may be coming in. I ran upstairs to be here. Tonight is a discussion, and the previous presentation on water have dealt more in the presentation and some of the discussions about the politics of water, the technical use of water, and how it's involved in our. Did we get you a chair that's okay, or not? Okay, good. And so what we thought we'd do tonight is bring some really bright, focused, gifted people to the table and just have a discussion about the big questions. The big questions that you see on your table: is water a right? Do we have responsibilities as far as education is concerned? And what are the implications of water in the Southeast? In a place where you don't think of water being an issue. I grew up in Midland, Texas. In Midland, Texas, you leave the water hose on overnight, you call it a river. You know, but my hometown is currently building a pipeline, several 100-mile pipeline, trying to find water for its citizens, while we're fracking at rates that are pretty phenomenal and using water in different ways. And so I had that perspective, and I heard people say, well, why is water an issue in a place like Tennessee where we're swimming in water? And so we thought we would bring together a group who are experts in relative areas to water and have a discussion time. I'd like to begin by letting you guys introduce yourselves and just work your way down the kind of the signposts in the evening. I'm going to let each of these, I'm going to ask questions of different members of the panel. We're going to dialogue for a while and talk about the topics involved, and then we'll also let, and toward the end, some questions from the audience. Now, we are the Institute for Conflict Management, and one thing we pride ourselves on is our civil conversations about difficult subjects. And so I want all you guys to behave up here tonight, because I don't want to have that problem with it. And same thing with our audience members, because something like this can be a very basic kind of meeting. People can feel very strongly about it, but we believe we can have different conversations in civil ways that are very productive. And I'm really excited about having this group. Andy, why don't you start and let each of you introduce yourselves and why you're here.
My name is Andy Borchers. I'm an associate professor in the College of Business. My interests are a little bit eclectic, as I do teach in the School of Computing, the Institute for Sustainable Practice, and now working with Phyllis in conflict management. I am a long-time, though not native, Detroit resident who has followed with great interest the Detroit bankruptcy and its relationship with the Detroit Water and Sewage Department, which is, I think, one of the key issues we wanted to talk about tonight.
Good evening. I'm Matt Harper. Came up today from Metro Atlanta. I've been involved with Metro Atlanta water planning in the past. Most recently, I worked for the State Infrastructure Bank, helping local governments find financing for their water infrastructure projects. And I was invited up today because of my friendship with Stephen Culp. He asked me to come up here and share my experience with Metro Atlanta and the water planning process that we've had success with down there.
Good evening. My name is Craig Phillip. Until July, I was CEO of Ingram Barge Company, which is the largest domestic marine transportation company in the United States, headquartered here in Nashville. Our company ran 5,000 barges and using 150 towboats on the Mississippi River system, which includes its major tributaries like the Cumberland River that comes here to Nashville. Our industry overall has about 5 times that number of assets. Like to think of it as the invisible mode of transportation. Even in a town like Nashville, many people don't realize that there's a tremendous amount of commerce that runs up and down this river that goes through downtown. About 15% of the ton miles of freight that move in the United States each year move by water, and for about 5% of the nation's freight bill. So it's an environmentally sustainable mode of transportation, very important to the health and vitality of the economy, both here in Middle Tennessee and in the United States.
I'm Pam Burnett. I'm the Executive Director of the Georgia Association of Water Professionals, and our association is about 4,000 individual members and about 200 utilities and corporate members throughout Georgia that have to do with the water profession and water professionals. Our mission, we're a 501c3 not-for-profit, and our mission is education and policy primarily. My background, I'm classically trained water resources manager, trained in the 70s, so I came straight out of the, out of the collaboration ethic, and was immediately disappointed as I started my career that everything was really siloed pretty solidly. So I think in my career, it's taken about 30 years till I really had the chance to start breaking down some of those silos. I started working for the Corps of Engineers in 1976, and then moved into regional planning. And now I look over statewide issues, primarily focusing on water utilities.
My name is David Wilson. I'm general counsel here at Lipscomb University, so I'm an attorney. Kind of give the legal perspective. I'm certainly not a water expert, so I'm kind of out of place up here with some of these people. But that being said, I was a partner at a law firm here in town for a number of years, and I currently serve on the board of directors of a 501c3 by the name of Living Water. Some of you may be familiar with that. We have funded over 150 clean water projects in 50 different countries around the world. So funding water and the use of water and allocation is very important to me. I think it's something that the Christian community certainly needs to focus more on, and that's one of my interests.
Good evening. My name is Edwin Sanders. I'm the senior servant at Metropolitan Interdenominational Church. We're a 34-year-old congregation that has been involved in transformative work within dispossessed, disinherited, and discounted communities around Nashville and throughout the United States, and to some degree around the world, especially in South Africa and Southeastern Africa. We refer to ourselves, we say that Metropolitan Interdenominational Church is a community of believers inclusive of all and alienating to none, leading the way to spiritual growth by sharing God's love with the world. We deal with the challenge of being inclusive of all and alienating to none every day. But one of the things that we talk about in the language we use very often is the language of being radically inclusive. And one of the ways in which that translates into this conversation we're going to have tonight is to really find where there is the point of connection as relates to issues, not only human rights, but also issues of social justice, because there's a way in which we very much believe that in order for the faith community to be responsible and accountable to that which we are called to do, issues like this have to be a part of the equation of our conversation.
So as you can see, I'm excited about the panel that Phyllis and Randy have put together. We've got a very eclectic, bright, articulate panel. I'm fully expecting some spirited conversation. I'll be depressed if there's not. We want to begin, as most of you are aware, there's an issue with water in inner city Detroit. And in fact, I believe there's been an appeal to the UN for a human rights violation for the water utilities, if I understand correctly, have cut off water to people who haven't paid their bill in Detroit, and it's escalated. So we will begin tonight by watching just a brief report about that experience. And I think the two individuals who may be most connected with that were Andy and David. You guys, would you begin the conversation by jumping on your perspectives of Detroit? And I'd like the rest of the panel then to take that and kind of spin that off into your areas of interest. You don't have to just talk about Detroit, but the larger issues that affect us here in Middle Tennessee. Does that sound fair? So let's go ahead and watch the video, and then we can begin. I may let Andy begin the conversation.
Senator.org, the War and Peace Report, anything different with Aaron that day?
Well, activists in Detroit have appealed to the UN over the city's move to shut off the water of thousands of residents. The Detroit Water Authority says half of its 323,000 accounts are delinquent. It has begun turning off the taps of those who do not pay bills that total about $150 or that are 60 days late. Since March, up to 3,000 account holders have had their taps shut off per week. The Detroit Water Authority carries an estimated $5 billion in debt and has been the subject of talks to privatize. Activists have been organizing against the water shutoffs, saying they target Detroit's most vulnerable families. This is Ann Rawl of the Michigan Welfare Rights Organization.
I want to tell you what 6 kids on this porch when they came to shut off the water, and their parents had to run to try to find how they're going to pay their water bill. Another woman, she's pregnant, she has a 2-year-old. She's holding the bill for $400 in her hand, and she's begging the man, don't turn off my water. A pregnant woman with a $400 bill. You're going to close the water off for a woman with a $400 bill who's pregnant and has a 2-year-old. Shame on you.
That was Ann Rawl of the Michigan Welfare Rights Organization, and a submission to the United Nations Special Rapporteur on the human right to safe drinking water and sanitation. Activists say Detroit is trying to push through a private takeover of its water system at the expense of basic rights. The group Food and Water Watch said by denying water service to thousands, Detroit is violating the human right to water. The poverty rate in Detroit is approximately 40%, and people have seen their water bills increase by 119% within the last decade. Most of the residents are African American. 2/3 of those impacted by the water shutoffs involve families with children. Meanwhile, the Detroit Water and Sewerage Department, or DWSD, has defended its actions, saying the water shutoffs are necessary for alleviating the department's debts. This is Greg Eno, Public Affairs Specialist at WSD.
We're trying to work with people more aggressively, let's put it that way, to try to get them either on payment plans or to get them paid, and it has worked. It has, we've increased our, we've lowered our debt a little bit by doing that.
For more, we go to Detroit, Michigan, where we're joined by Maureen Taylor, the state chair of the Michigan Welfare Rights Organization. In Ottawa, Canada, we're joined by Meera Karunananthan, an international water campaigner for the Blue Planet Project. Her group filed the submission to the UN Special Rapporteur regarding the right to drinking water in Detroit. We invited Detroit's emergency manager, Kevin Orr, to join us on the program, but his office declined our request. Maureen and Meera, thanks for joining us. Maureen, tell us what's happening on the ground. People must be scratching their heads around the United States and around the world to hear this. How many people are having their water cut off in Detroit every week?
We're getting conflicting information, and good morning to you. We're told that it's anywhere from 3,000 per month to 3,000 per week. It is historical for the Detroit Water and Sewage Department to not give its residents information, but at our offices at Michigan Welfare Rights, we are getting 30 to 40 calls an hour where people are saying, I either have a water bill and I'm afraid that my water is about to be cut off, or my water has already been cut off. What can you do to help us and give us some information? So it is scandalous, and we live in the Great Lakes. And to have water threatened, and people told that if your bill is $150 or more, you're on a block, a chopping block, where your water is going to be turned off. In Michigan, it is particularly egregious because a household that has welfare involvement and water is turned off with minor children in a home means that protective services can come in and take the children out and put them in foster care. And in a foster care home, you can earn more money as a foster parent than you can as a birth mother. It's just scandalous what's going on in Detroit, just scandalous.
And what can families do if they don't have water? Where do they get clean water?
Well, again, we live in the Great Lakes, so it's an outrage to even have this discussion, that this kind of attack is going on. What we advise people to do is, first of all, we get information on what is the reason why you may be behind on your water bill. We have multiple agencies and organizations that we can send people to get partial payments. We try to encourage people to set up payment plans. But the number of people that are under attack, and again, we're talking about blue-collar workers in Detroit. This is an orchestrated attack by banks and corporations and whatnot in an effort to try to enrich themselves. And so as the water department is trying to justify this egregious behavior, we didn't have any choice. But our colleagues in Canada that suggested perhaps we should go to the UN, we jumped at the opportunity, and we are expecting the United Nations to come to Detroit, take a look at what's going on here, and to make some kind of declarations about human rights violations. This is an outrage.
Meera Karunananthan, you're with the Blue Planet Project. Your group authored this report to the UN. Can you talk about what this statement, this appeal says?
The United Nations will look at the facts, look at what's happening in Detroit, and join us in declaring this a violation of the human right to water and sanitation. If you listen to the Department of Water and Sewerage in Detroit, you would think this is a case of people not paying for running shoes they purchased, but we're talking about the water and sanitation services the people in Detroit are entitled to. This is their public water and sanitation utility, and so the level of cutoffs that we're seeing in Detroit. It's absolutely outrageous. It is a scandal, and it's a human rights violation. And these are not the measures that should be taken by the city to address the problem of underfunding to the water and sanitation services.
Mira, how much?
Now we're calling on the U.S. government. We're calling on Congress to intervene. We're calling on the state of Michigan to intervene because both the federal government and the state have obligations to ensure that the rights of the people in the city of Detroit are.
So you have a very articulate presentation of one of the perspectives of what's going on in Detroit. And what we'd like to do is, as you see that, begin to talk about that situation and then expand the conversation to Tennessee, to the southeast, and where we stand at this moment. I know that Tennessee has a Water Quality Control Act that basically says the government of Tennessee has an obligation to take all prudent steps to secure, protect, and preserve the right to water. So here we stand. So I'd love to begin with Dr. Borchers, and been very involved in that, Detroit. Could you share with us some perspectives you have after hearing this?
I was taking notes as I listened to that, and certainly any of us would have empathy for a family with young children that didn't have water. But this whole notion of a right to water has an underlying question. Is there a right to clean water? And if there is, who's going to pay for it? Because it isn't free. And we can try to act like economics aren't in fact in place. A baseball player could believe that the laws of physics don't act, but I think they do. And so throughout this conversation about rights and water and caring about people, there are economic issues here. The city of Detroit's been in terrible decline since the 1950s. Having lived in that area extensively, I've seen it, and it has been terribly sad. They've gone through bankruptcy, and as part of that bankruptcy, I believe some overeager bureaucratic people said, hey, we've got a lot of uncollected bills, let's start collecting them. They did so in a rather callous way, and if they'd had a little more sense, they could have started collecting bills like every major U.S. city collects water bills. Let's not kid ourselves. Every city has some policy to collect water bills. You have to. Otherwise, you have the problem the economists would call it of the free rider. Why would anybody pay if they don't have to? And some of the critics in Detroit would point out the payment rate on cell phone bills is about 65%. The payment on water is about 50%. Now you tell me what's essential. There is also underlying this bankruptcy, this historic conflict between the wealthy suburbs, some of which are AAA bond rated, managed exquisitely well, and the city of Detroit, which frankly, until a few years ago, the Detroit Water and Sewage Department was operated as a criminal enterprise by a former mayor who now has a 28-year lease on a cell in a federal prison. And the Detroit Water and Sewage Department was the place where he was making a lot of his money. And so if you're in the suburbs, you look at this, and certainly you care about people, but you say, wait a minute, so my rates are going to go up, and I'm going to pay for inept, worse than that, corrupt operations. And it really raises questions. So, the whole story came to a head in part, I believe, because of overeagerness to collect money in a city that is bankrupt and going through bankruptcy. The Detroit Water and Sewage Department is one of two assets the city has. The other is the famed Detroit Institute of Arts. And otherwise, there's almost nothing left in terms of assets for the city. And so that is, I think, the context there. She railed against the banks. They made less than 20 cents on the dollar. The pensioners from the city of Detroit are within 95% of their payment. So I think the emotions run high on this. Suburban Detroit area have really had some conflict, although if you step back from the water issue, the whole bankruptcy has been a story that brings an interesting scenario of a Republican governor that decided to help a city which would give him 0 votes to get their finances turned around and become economically viable. And I think that's the really better story. The water thing is certainly emotional and real at the same time.
David, why don't you add, and then I want to open it up to the Reverend and some others who maybe have a perspective that we need to hear also. David?
Sure. I'll take a minute and talk about the bankruptcy that Detroit's gone through. Back in 2013, they filed Chapter 9 bankruptcy, the largest in history. And in connection with that, as they mentioned in this clip, there was an amount that they were owing to bondholders for sewage and water bonds of about $5 billion. The Detroit Water and Sewage Department had outstanding delinquent bills totaling $175 million. So what they were trying to do was restructure, reorganize, and the department was trying to get people to pay their bills. And you may have heard about this. The residents of Detroit came to the bankruptcy judge and requested a moratorium on shutting off the water. They wanted the judge to issue a restraining order so that the department could no longer shut off water for people who had delinquent water bills, and they wanted to do it for 6 months. The judge ultimately held that he did not have the authority to grant such a moratorium, and what he said also from the bench in his decision was that water is not a human right. Now, his decision was really predicated upon bankruptcy law, which is very specific as to the rights of municipal debtors, and it also is predicated on the 10th Amendment, which restricts the federal government's ability to impose restrictions on the state and local municipalities. So really, what he was trying to do was, he was limited in his authority for the bankruptcy court because they have limited subject matter jurisdiction, but he also made this sideswipe and said, water's not a human right. I really think that his statement was a little bit out of line. It didn't necessarily need to be made, and it didn't necessarily follow from the facts or from what the issues were before the court. I think it's interesting, though, that he made that. I don't think it's going to be binding precedent on any other courts. The bankruptcy court has very limited jurisdiction. I don't think too many courts dealing with constitutional matters will look to a bankruptcy court as to whether water is a human right. But in case you're unaware, that is out there, and that has created a lot of turmoil, a lot of backlash about whether or not this is a fundamental right. I think it's important to our discussion tonight.
You heard the perspectives, and so you've got this city, from what I hear, the city's in trouble, they're trying to find money. Hey, all cities collect water bills. Why can't they collect water bills? Why is it that people out in the suburbs, why should they pay more? I don't understand. Would you give a different perspective, perhaps, or another perspective from this, from the world you live in?
Right. Well, let's say another perspective.
Okay.
I think that one of the things that we have to, well, first let me do something I feel is important, because I am going to speak from a theological, to some degree, faith-centered, or spiritual perspective. Are there any people in this room that are not of the Judeo-Christian tradition? Are there any people in this room who are Buddhists or of any other tradition? Okay, all right. Because one of the things that gets to be important, even when you talk about these issues, if you're going to speak to them from a perspective that is dealing with issues of ethics, issues of morality, and issues of that which is just, right, fair, and the like, it's good to make sure you can find some point of common ground. And very often when we talk about these issues from a moral perspective, and our frame of reference is strictly the Judeo-Christian tradition, we end up maybe compromising our ability to hear all perspectives. So I always ask that question so I can be sure. But I will tell you this, and it's probably significant in terms of talking about water as a human right. Very often when I'm in multi-faith environments, one of the things I always look for is where is the common ground? Where are there threads of common understanding, value, and the like? And one of the things I very often use is water. Because water, the ones I use all the time are water, light, and fire. You can go to any faith tradition, and you will find that those themes will present themselves throughout. But it's also interesting, especially when I was listening to David, because David and my wife practiced law together for many years. And when we introduce ourselves sometimes, we'll say, well, we both do law. And she'll say, I do man's law, he does God's law. So I think a part of what I'm saying to you, though, is significant, in that regard. Because on one level of the conversation, if you consider it purely in terms of the ways in which this dilemma has been handled in Detroit, around the judicial response, around the ways in which the politics, as well as the socioeconomic dynamics of it have been brought to light. One of the things that you don't hear very often, although this video, I thought, did a job of at least touching upon it in a significant way, is to hear the voices of those who probably are the carriers of the torch of the theological perspective, the moral, ethical, and the like, in terms of the belief systems that people bring to the table. The first thing you have to understand is when you talk about Detroit, you're talking about an environment and a community where in general there is a mitigating sense of distrust in terms of what is transpiring on the part of those who do represent the power elite, those who are the brokers of authority, and those who are very often end up being the decision makers. And even though you get some glimpse every now and then of an individual who seemingly has risen to the ranks of leadership in a way that was not inhibited by those other forces of power, as was the case with Brother Kwame, who I guess is now serving his time for the injustices and the like he was involved in. The fact is that you're dealing with a community that from the very basic point of perspective has a tremendous sense of distrust. And I guarantee you there are ways in which that can be validated and looked at.
I agree totally.
Yeah. The next thing that I immediately did was I preach in Detroit often. So I just picked up the phone and called some of my preacher friends who are forces of witness in terms of what justice should look like in that city. And it is the case that this issue of inequity and this issue of the process by which the execution of the law has unfolded has been seen as being somehow unjust. So let me see if I can frame it for you in a way that is important. I guess one of the things I didn't say to you, although I guess in my bio it kind of says it, probably the only real point of intellectual grounding that I have in my life is as an anthropologist. And in that sense, I try to very much be an interdisciplinary thinker. The same thing is true in terms of how I come to issues of theology. And what I would say to you is that what you are dealing with in what's going on in Detroit can definitely not be looked at in any one-dimensional way. It's not just about the issue of clean water. It's not just about the ways in which the process of business is going forward in terms of the collection of bills and whatever the inequities, injustices, or questions are in that process. But you also, I think, have to deal with the fact that what you are dealing with is something that has to be framed in a much larger way. What's going on in Detroit right now is not something that is the byproduct of some people who decided recently that they were not going to pay their bills or rebellious about the ways in which those bills were being collected. That's not something that has just started. If you look at where this problem has its roots, there's a way in which you have to consider the social determinants that have been evolving over generations that simply bring us to a point of another breakdown of the ways in which systems and institutions are working in that city. It's not just what's going on when people can't pay the water bill. I asked you just to turn your clock back 6 years, and the same thing was happening with the major corporations in that city in terms of their inability to be able to function effectively in a community where there was systematic deterioration in terms of the whole economic environment and quality of existence of all the people. The other thing that lends itself to this whole business of really fear and also a real sense of distrust is what people see in terms of what the future of Detroit is going to be like. One of the things that's true in urban areas across this country is that land that historically has been of great value, and had tremendous opportunity and possibility, which in many instances has become a part of the syndrome of gentrification, ends up being the land that is inhabited now by a lot of people who have, who are going to be, I don't think it's a matter of might be, who are going to be and are being displaced. I don't know how well many of you know Detroit, but Detroit has to be one of the most beautiful cities you can imagine in terms of being able to live along the river and lake communities and the way in which it ends up being very attractive. A lot of that land has been the place where the greatest deterioration of the city has occurred. So a part of what I'm calling distrust and suspicion is the byproduct of the ways in which those lands are being very systematically taken and transformed into what will be the next generation of, even in a place like Nashville, translates into what allows you to come up with a it city. Because if you look at Nashville as the it city, one of the things you realize that has happened in this city as well has been the displacement of a lot of people who lived in communities that became vulnerable and no longer. And the other thing I would just say to you in terms of a little bit of, people understand this, a little bit of maritime history throughout all of time. I tell people all the time, if you want to invest wisely in terms of land in urban areas, just find the water and go invest in it. You know, go to Memphis and look at what used to be the warehouses in the slums. You know, you could go around the country, it's the same phenomenon. What I'm saying to you is that there are people that have, I think, legitimate basis for their suspicion. And it's not just something that has happened because of these water bills, it's generational. And this ends up being yet another part of it.
So yeah, I'm sorry. So what I heard you say is sometimes it's about water, but it's not about water all at the same time. Is that fair enough?
It's a lot bigger than just the issue of water.
And I think that translates, I think, to the bigger picture, even as we move down this direction. And I want to ask Pam for a minute, because I think, could you take some of the things they talked about and talk about how now those concepts that we've heard so far is water a right, the mistrust of those who haven't had access to basics in life toward society, the idea that infrastructure, you know, has to be paid for. I mean, is I'm a recovering Texan. I try not to tell people that. But as our less than eloquent governor, who's finally now going out of office, once said, yeah, water's free as long as you want to drink it from the stream where the deer droppings are. The rest of it has to be paid for. You know, that all that in mind, you know, how does that play out in Georgia and what you were doing?
Well, your points are very interesting. There's a couple of parallels, certainly in the city of Atlanta, as you said, just about any city that's been knocked hard by a rough economy for the last 7 years. We have much of those same situations in Atlanta. As far as water bills, that is a big issue in Atlanta. There's some large bills that are not getting paid, and there is a law you can't take water away from a residence, but you can shut down a business, and you can shut down properties that have been foreclosed and abandoned. And if somebody comes in and wants to buy them, you have a right to collect the water bill from the buyer. And that's a big deal. I'll tell you what, the real estate industry in Georgia really combats. If you want to collect on a water bill, they'll be the first ones there battling you over water conservation, over anything that might make it a little more difficult to transfer a property. And that sometimes is very frustrating. On the water war side, though, the question that I had there is, when we get into water wars, and you've probably heard that there's a little one down in Georgia, Alabama, and Florida right now, and we've been working on that issue for over 20 years. And I have to tell you, every time we get into really debating the details, I mean, we are looking at molecules of water and how do you fairly apportion these kinds of things. And you can get right down to where everybody says, okay, that might be fair, and then somebody walks away. And it occurs to me that every time we start talking about these things technically, fairness, equity, anything that makes sense to me works, but the agreements never go forward because it's not about water. In the end, it's not about water. And so water practitioners get very earnest about the science. And it's so incredibly frustrating to watch, watch all of the science go to waste because it's not really about water. And I guess that's one
So
thing.
what's it about?
Well,
I'll ask the obvious question.
I'd love to ask the audience what they think it's all about, but I guess in a bit it's power and control and dominance, and he who has the water wins, the most water wins, and we know in Atlanta that you look back 100 years and it was the airport that helped gain dominance for the city of Atlanta and Georgia over Birmingham. Once we had that, now it's water. We live in a state that has abundant rainfall, but we live on a water slide, so the water hits the state and slides off. We don't really have any, we don't have enough storage for the water that we have, but we don't really have a supply problem, we have a storage problem. And then it becomes, well, whatever we have, we can apportion it, there's enough.
So what I hear you saying, yeah. So what are you saying? You have these water wars, and it hadn't just always been Georgia, Alabama, Florida. At one time, it might have been Tennessee and Georgia, over where the state line was drawn, access to water.
Yeah.
I mean, you have all these kinds of different things going on, right? And you're saying it's very frustrating as a water person that you can't get to scientific conclusion because there's so many other things going on.
Right, and that really isn't the bottom line. Water
Okay.
is not the bottom line.
Interesting.
And if I could just say, I've been waiting for that Tennessee comment, but as far as Georgians go, really, it's such a minor thing. That isn't something we talk about.
Mhm.
There's a small group of people that talk about it, but there's a financial
Of
incentive
course,
for that.
there's other things going on.
Right, I would say that most Georgians are very sincere in wanting to share. And I think when you really sincerely say, let's share, you can have that collaborative conversation. You can really get down to deciding how things should be divvied up. You get there, and then somebody else comes in and says, I don't want that resolved, because then that takes away a disadvantage and gives somebody else a different
Interesting.
advantage.
Matt, do you want to add to that or take that conversation anywhere, or do you want to?
Can I get my slides, please? While he's pulling it up, Reverend Sanders talked about common ground. Would y'all entertain me for just a moment and let me just start with everyone raising a hand. And when you disagree with the statement, just lower your hand. So everyone raise your hand. If you believe that, if you disagree with the statement, lower your hand. Water is essential for public health, if you disagree. Water is essential for public safety. Water is essential to sustain our environment. Looks like we have common ground. So, when I heard about tonight and kind of some of the key messages about how do we, is water literacy an imperative? Absolutely. We can't begin to move the conversation on fixing the real issues until we all come to some basis of understanding. If I could have the clicker there. So in Metro Atlanta, we really have to start with the basic, get to the most basic level of kind of elevator speech with water. And so, let's see if this is going to work here. So one of the underlying fundamental concepts in Metro Atlanta and water is it's all granite underneath the city. Imagine, we have a mountain down there called Stone Mountain. It's a granite outcrop. But imagine that extending underneath the entire city. Well, that limits how much access we have to groundwater. We don't have, quote, aquifers in the Metro Atlanta area like y'all have access to. In fact, we think that less than 1% of Metro Atlanta water is from groundwater as its viable source. So it immediately limits us to surface water sources. Let's see. Is this, there we go. So the next point that we bring up is Metro Atlanta is located in the headwaters of a lot of different watersheds. So that deals with our availability to have large reservoirs that store water, have large surface water bodies that we can withdraw a lot of water out of, and it also limits how much wastewater we can discharge into these small headwater creeks. The small headwater creeks just can't sustain that. So that means we've got to break up our wastewater treatment plants across the watershed. And we have to move more water across basin boundaries to serve all the people in the different parts of the Metro Atlanta area. So then we talk about, there we go. So we talk about, all right, well, let's own how much water we actually use. And let's get comfortable with that number. It's a big area, a lot of people, a lot of jobs, a lot of people having children. A lot of people want those children to grow up in within driving distance of the grandparents or the parents. And then we move on to where our water comes from. 73% of our water comes from either the Chattahoochee or Lake Lanier, which are also tied to federally controlled water bodies. So our dependence on those water bodies and the interaction with the water wars, that's really the backbone of the water system in Metro Atlanta, is those federal reservoirs. And so that has a large influence on how we manage our water. So to that end, we talk about collaboration, we talk about people pulling resources together. In 2001, the Metropolitan North Georgia Water Planning District was formed. I had the pleasure of working with Pam on the updates of these plans in 2009 when we revised these plans. And this code citation of Georgia law is cited here for anyone that is curious, but it's required by Georgia law that at the time 16 counties when it was formed and over 90 cities get together, pool resources, actually are charged fees per person in the jurisdiction to fund this planning effort. And then EPD, the State Environmental Protection Division, is required to enforce those plans and the requirements of those plans for things that include things like water conservation, different management of your wastewater system, different stormwater controls and ordinances, and not issue permits unless the local governments are in compliance with these plans. On top of that, if you're looking to get funding for any either state loan or state grant, if you're not in compliance, you're not eligible to get those state dollars. That's some planning with some teeth. I mean, people pay attention, and so things get done. So then we talk about, well, where's our water get actually used? Because me and my neighbor are sitting there talking in the front yard. It's not my fault. It's that big industry down the street. It's not my fault. I'm not using water. I'm not polluting the environment. Well, it actually is. Single family, 40% of Metro Atlanta water use. Multifamily, 13% of the water use. So residential water use accounts for most of the water use. If you're looking at, kind of where to point to go for the low-hanging fruit or where you can solve the biggest problem, address water conservation, you start looking at, where the water is in the home. 21% of that water use is used for outdoor irrigation. Toilets, another 15%. Showers, 13%. Faucet, 14%. So you can start crafting water conservation programs that chip away at the biggest portions of that water use. There's no reason to issue say a rebate for a dishwasher when dishwashers only make up 5% of the water use inside the home. That's not kind of the best bang for your buck, if you will. So,
in about a couple more minutes.
Okay. So water conservation, you talk about different ways to approach people. Metropolitan North Georgia Water Planning District created a water conservation campaign called MyDropCounts.org. They have a race, a water conservation themed race along the Chattahoochee River, along with a water conservation type festival after it to educate people about water use. Different kind of infographics. All these images that I'm showing tonight are from this MyDropCounts website. So turn off the water while you brush your teeth. you say that, but if you don't make it fun and easy to consume, you've got to make this stuff approachable. It's, at the end of the day, unless you're very passionate about it, it can seem pretty boring and, yeah, water conservation, that's fine. But you make it interesting. Saving water saves energy. Saving energy saves water. If you don't have demand for that energy production for hydroelectric power, then they're not using, it's kind of a cycle there. So, and my last point that I'll move on from, since the district was created, the first 10 years that it was in place, the district's 15, 16 county area has grown by over 1 million people, but reduced its water use by over 10%.
And so I appreciate that, because here's what we've heard across the board. I'm going to come back to Craig, because so we have a place like Detroit that sits on the Great Lakes, right? And to have swimming in fresh water that's having water issues. You have Metro Atlanta on the flip side, who's having to figure out how to very strategically plan for those water issues. And you still have kind of the social justice question: who gets to engage that? Should you be spending water on your lawn when you've got all these bigger issues happening? And then just real quickly with Craig, just for a couple minutes, but then even though Atlanta, you have 43% of the water use in Atlanta being single family, in the larger picture, only about 10% of fresh water gets used in the single family. The engagement, 90% is more in the commercial, nationwide. So here's a guy who's made his living dealing with waterways. Craig, what is your perspective on this discussion, kind of where you come from at this point?
Good evening. Really glad to be here. Thank you for the invitation. I've got some slides too. I don't know if anybody's pulling those together, but I wanted to share a couple of them. But I've spent my whole career in the freight transportation world. Most of it has been in the maritime side, running boats, barges, ships along the coastlines of the United States, up the rivers, and we have, as a result, been very interested in the health and sustainability of these river systems, because at the end of the day, they are to us what railroad tracks are to railroads, what highways are to truckers, and so we've always been very concerned about the fact that there are many stakeholders that lay claim to the water. Let's just take rivers for now, that run up and down in our rivers, and I have been called by some of my peers in our industry the king of the water wars for us, because I've often been a point person in our industry's enthusiastic attempts at conflict resolution with people who have different claims at the water than we do. And it's been a pretty diverse crowd of people that we have engaged with over time. We've engaged with Native American tribes who have historical legacy interests in some parts of watersheds. We've engaged with environmentalists who have a desire to see the waterways in this country return to the way they were before man interrupted them and disrupted them and built dams and locks and levees and that sort of thing. We've been engaged with communities who have an interest in seeing their riverfronts protected for the use of human populations, for all of us who want to use for recreation. We've had disputes with hunters who want to preserve areas of water as places for ducks to land so that they can take aim at them, honestly. So I've always felt comfortable being an advocate and a proponent and a defender of what I think are the legitimate interests of the industry that I've been part of and represent. That is a vital part of making sure that the U.S. economy is healthy and has vitality, that we can move goods and goods for sure, at the lowest possible cost, hopefully with the least net environmental impact. And I have to tell you, I sit here tonight with this issue presented, and have to say that as a person of faith, I have a lot of difficulty not acknowledging that an individual human being's access to clean water, if it's available, isn't an underlying right. And as I was sharing with some people getting ready for this, it almost feels like there's a hierarchy of needs, and that is a need which probably trumps many, many others. I would say that it probably trumps the needs of my industry at the margin, and maybe at its heart if it ever got presented. I never was involved in a conflict resolution situation where we were looking at alternatives that meant clean water for someone or not. Although I will say that if you take at the extreme the idea that maybe we should remove locks, for example, in dams from many of the waterways, and we have them in the Cumberland River right here. Without those dams, we wouldn't have clean water coming into this building tonight because we depend on the Cumberland River for the water that we take for granted. And there's plenty of water in Tennessee, as you know, and like Georgia, if you didn't have these impounding systems, you wouldn't keep the water around so that you could use it effectively. So it's never gotten to that for me, where I've had to try to take the economic self-interest of the company and the industry that I've often been privileged to represent, and have to debate with somebody who is saying you can preserve your domain, but you're going to do it at the expense of water for some individual human being. So
I appreciate that, because what I hear from you guys, this is a very complicated issue. We range from, we not only have the human rights of access to clean water, but we also have the city issue of how do we develop the infrastructure to sustain a life that we're used to, along with our corporate issues of how do we use water in an appropriate way to sustain our economy. I mean, it's a big picture. So I have we just have a few more minutes before I ask your questions. I have a couple of questions I want us to talk about. And so, do you on this committee agree water is a basic human right? Or is water, and I'm going to ask the silly question, since it has to be paid for, does that take it off the table as a human right? Or how do you approach the idea that access to water is a social justice? Or does anyone feel like that it may not reach that level on this committee? Who will be courageous enough to
it's interesting that and I appreciate, by the way, the fact that you spoke to the question. I noticed that none of us has just come down and said, do we believe water is a human right? So I want to be clear about the fact, I believe that water is a human right. I couldn't help but when you had your hands up, I came up with the question that I know would determine that some people would put their hands down. And that is, so if you put your hands up now and leave your hands up, and let me just ask one more question. Okay. Should water be free? See, and that's where you get down to where a lot of the issue is here. Since I'm supposed to speak from a theological perspective, let me just say this to you. If you want effective information dissemination, especially in some of the communities like in Detroit that are being most disproportionately impacted, the voices that you need really are the voices of those who very often are faith leaders. So in that sense, it gets to be really important to understand that biblically, you can use water as a tremendous vehicle by which you can talk about these complex issues. Because even if you start with, and for the faith generation, the Judeo-Christian tradition, if you start with the book of Genesis, you always find that the clear geographic point of references there is the reference to two rivers. If you go all the way to the end, it ends up talking about the idea of a utopia, of a world to come where there is a great river that runs through it all. If you look all the way in between, you will find that prophetic voices use references to water in very positive ways. So I'm just thinking about the example that you gave a minute ago in terms of the marketing of the issue and the projecting of the issue. I'm just saying, I think the theological perspective gets to be a very important one, especially if you're going to deal with overcoming distrust and all that kind of thing. You need somebody who can speak positively about it and then maybe become a part of the vehicle for information dissemination and change. The other thing in it is, just in terms of your question, is that I do think we have to talk forthrightly, though, about whether or not it's a human right and whether or not that means there's a way in which it should be free. Because the other thing that I saw in the chart that you gave is you might say that single family and multifamily use is the greatest, but then ask the question, who's the greatest polluter of the waters? And I think that a part of, over time, I think we're at a better point we've probably ever been in history in terms of holding industry accountable as far as pollution is concerned. But we have to talk about that and figure out, and I'll have to defer to you in terms of the statistics to some degree on that. But I do know that, for instance, in Cleveland, you know, when the Cleveland River became so polluted that it caught on fire, it was ultimately resolved by the ways in which they dealt with industry in that community.
Dr. Borcher, would you respond to that?
Just a quick thought about water free. If you ask me would I like water to be free, I'd say yes. If you ask me can water be free, I would tell you that's an economic impossibility. To ask for water to be free is impossible because it costs in order to cleanse it and deliver it. So we can wish upon a star if you'd like to, but let's get real here. Somehow it has to be paid for. Now I will make the observation back to Detroit's case. In the video, they complained about it becoming privatized. Cooler heads have prevailed, and Detroit now has a regional water authority, which the governor wisely has appointed people from the city and from the counties in as politically neutral a way as he could come up with, a way to go forward. Because alternatives, if that didn't happen, is the suburbs would say, hey, we can put a straw out in Lake St. Clair just as much as Detroit can, and then Detroit would be left with an infrastructure and nobody to pay for it. And they'd be in a real mess. So I think there are ways we can get to this, but ultimately water costs money. And if you think it doesn't, it does, in as much as you might want it to be that way, and you're wishing upon a star.
And so it could be, the question becomes, not should water be free, but, and we may not be able to have this discussion completely tonight, but the question we may want to leave here with is, should then the poorest and most dispossessed in society receive it at no cost and be absorbed by another part of society for them to receive it? And that may be a fairer question to go to,
Yeah,
which
very much so.
I want to move it to another question in and bring it to Tennessee. So I said, I come from far west Texas, where water is a massive issue and has been for many years, right? I move here, and it seems like Tennessee's kind of a wash of water. To me, nobody's telling me I can't run my sprinklers 24 hours a day, right? So if Tennessee's kind of swimming, we got Atlanta down here going, wait a minute, we're on top of Stone Mountain, it's running off, we're having to be really careful, we keep expanding. You've got Detroit saying our infrastructure's falling apart. You guys tell me just real quickly, a couple of you, what's the Tennessee issue in terms of water? What are we facing? What's our responsibility? Are we looking at Detroit? Are we looking at Atlanta? Are we looking at something else? Who wants to jump in there? We got to be quick. We've got about 10 minutes for a discussion. Who else wants to give me an idea? What might be the water issue for Nashville and the people sitting in this room in the next 20 years?
Well, let me just chime in and say the issue that started all of the collaboration, for the most part, in Metro Atlanta was clean water, stormwater runoff, non-point source pollution,
right.
Issues with total maximum daily loads, streams not meeting water quality standards. And that was the reason why many of these local governments started funding and getting together to pool resources to work towards common kind of watershed type goals. So I think the Tennessee link is if it's not supply, if there's plenty of supply, then it's going to be water quality if it's not already.
So Dodd here, who works in that area, I mean, we have one of the most polluted streams in the region running right through this campus. Is that fair enough?
Yeah, it's the same type dynamic that, when we think about water right outside our doors being plentiful at the same time being polluted, it changes the thinking about, well, what's my contribution to that? If it's coming right out of my yard into the stream and the stream's polluted, it's kind of big. One thing that's unique about Tennessee is that I think is a little bit different from Georgia, is that we seem to have a allocation
it could not be just one issue. It's a big issue, and who's consuming how it's being used and how it's being polluted. So what else, real quick, did you start to say something? We'll come back.
Well, when we talked about it being bigger than water, one of the things you'd have to do is reconsider tax structures, because that's where you would determine how you might have sufficient resource in order to make at least, if not free, at least at low enough, a sufficiently low enough cost that it wouldn't translate into the same level of burden. Because the issue really is, and I'm going to stick with my argument for a while. By the way, I have the same argument with Billy all day. My wife represents public utilities and land use all the time. But one of the things that we talked about a lot is, and this is all I want to say, your question, which I think we have to discuss, is where are the priorities in terms of that which translate into entitlement? And I think that one of the things that would be interesting is for us to look at other countries in the world where some of the issues play out differently, mainly because of the nature of the population of the country. A lot of the difficulties that we have in America, people always say we are a melting pot. One of my friends said we're probably more like a tossed salad, because we're all in there together, but we really don't cohere in a lot of ways. So when you start getting to this whole issue of common ground, for instance, in religious circles, it's amazing how many dietary standards end up being the basis of difference. For water, it's the same for everybody. So the issue ends up being how do you, so I'm pushing again the common ground issue, and that is, the issue is if you can decide it is a priority at the level, because it does have to do with all those things you said that were so important. It does have to do with the quality, with healthcare, quality of health. It does have to do with the overall quality of life. As a matter of fact, your former governor in Georgia probably made one of the ultimate statements on this issue, Jimmy Carter, where he said that if the water is not a human right and not determined to be a human right, it would probably undermine all the other human rights that we find ourselves wanting to champion and celebrate.
And so
I think it might be a little bit of a, I think that's pretty much what he said.
And what I hear coming out of this is interesting is that, one thing we might have to face is, as we grow, and Tennessee continues to grow, Nashville continues to grow, we may have to look at our tax structure and how we go about providing water for the dispossessed and those who have less, and could it be more? And I think one of the people, the UN I read, said basically water flows toward power is what the statement out of the UN, whether it's accurate or not, at least this was part of their human rights statement, that that's fair or not. And so real quickly, I want you guys, those who haven't touched, real quick, make a comment, and we'll let the audience have about 15 minutes of continuing. We'll just go down the road here.
Sure. Like Reverend Sanders, I think that what the international community has to say is very important and is very insightful into this issue. And it's interesting that in November 2013, the UN had a proposal for a proclamation that water is a human right. Water and sanitation are a human right. At that time, the United States was the lone holdout from signing that proclamation. Every other member country of the UN said, yes, water is a human right. So the U.S. came in and said, we need to revise this statement. It's not accurate. It's too expansive. They didn't say why, but just said it's too expansive. It got revised, and then they came up with, pardon the pun, a watered-down version. So
there's lots of water puns out there.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that the United States is not willing to say why it doesn't think water is a human right, but being a skeptic, I think it might be that the United States sees water wars in the future, if not in the present, and is trying to preserve its right and ability to take and preserve water for itself and use it however it wants. But I think it is interesting that the rest of the world recognizes it as a human right except for us.
Okay. And would you like to make
Just
a comment?
2 quick points. One, first of all, we have the Eastern water law here, and then there's the Western water law where you're from. In the West, water isn't it isn't a right. So you can't get that agreement in the U.S. because you have 2 different water doctrines. That's probably would
Where I
realize
come
that.
from, water's a mineral right you can own.
That's exactly right. You own it and you can sell it.
You can sell it.
It's a commodity. So that was one point. The other one, I did want to talk about a big issue in Georgia and what we've done as part of our water conservation practice is setting up our water rates appropriately. I mean, this is about the most affordable thing you will ever have access to. This is pretty much free right here to us. I mean, if you really look at your water bill, you pay practically nothing for clean, reliable, constant water
Delivered.
delivered to you and, you know, to your door, to your bathroom. And the stuff in the toilet gets taken away. And so I think that, you know, it is already pretty much free to the consumers, and we don't appreciate that.
Interesting.
So, you know, from a utility perspective.
So from a delivery perspective, you're saying, wait a minute, we're getting all worked up about free when we're providing probably the cheapest product that could possibly be provided. Is that what I hear you saying?
I really believe that, and I think that what we're trying to do with water rates, you know, over the years, there was the declining block, now there's the inclining, so that there is a baseline that makes it for people who just drink water and flush the toilet an incredibly cheap water bill. Now, if you want to go take this great product and throw it all over your lawn, it's going to cost you more money, and that's the incentive not to use this for consumptive loss. But anyway, water rates are a big part of what's been a sea change in Georgia, and that's why you see a continuing decline. And I challenge anybody to say that that hasn't happened in Georgia. There's a tremendous change in water use.
Craig, what do you want to add to this discussion?
Only to reiterate that when you make something free, it gets abused and it gets overused and it gets underappreciated, and whatever pipes delivered this water to us today are probably 100 years old, and they're not going to last forever, and we're leaving a deplorable legacy to our children and grandchildren, because at some point this infrastructure is going to cease to function so that we can't rely on this. And it's not going to be whether you're in Atlanta or Nashville or Denver or Phoenix, where they have all sorts of issues on top that are making it top of mind today. It's going to happen everywhere because the infrastructure is so old.
And infrastructure costs money.
And you asked, and it costs money, and it's not going to be free. And you asked about what kind of defines water in the world of Tennessee today. We were left with a gift from our grandparents' generation, and that was the Tennessee Valley Authority. Yes. And you can like them or hate them, or you probably do both, but they left this state with an incredible, rich, free resource, and in the system that they created that makes this water so useful to us today, whether we're fishermen or hunters or consumers and drinkers or the businesses that use that water, and we should be paying more attention to how valuable that is to the state and all of us.
Fantastic. Real short statement here, Matt. What would you add? Anything else?
I would just say that it's important for all of us to remember, in my humble opinion, the people that are the greatest environmentalists of our day are those men and women that make providing this glass of water possible, maintaining those pumps and pipes, treating the drinking water. Pam's organization has a drinking water contest throughout the state to figure out who has the best drinking water. There's a lot of pride in this product they produce and reliably deliver to us. So, you know, people that are asking you to pay a water bill get a bad rap, but they are also the people that care the most about providing that resource to you.
Real quickly, by point of comparison, our friends in Europe pay probably twice as much for water on average than we do. Rates are much higher there. Most of their systems are privatized. I think there's a lot of good to be said for the publicly provided water systems we have, but I would echo to the point that the lack of investment in infrastructure is going to catch up to us sooner or later, whether it's in roads or water or other things, and we'll pay the price sooner or later.
That's a lack of political will.
That's right.
And so here we are. You know, we don't have much time, but basically moving from Detroit to Atlanta to Tennessee, the big questions are, is water a right? And there's many who would say yes, maybe a few who say no. I think almost everybody says the question is not whether water should be free, but should it be free to people, or close to free for people who essentially can't afford it and paid for by other people. That becomes the larger question. And then the other question becomes, is an infrastructure issue. That if we want to continue to provide what we have, are we investing enough in the kind of infrastructure to continue to provide that, and who's going to pay for that? So at this point, that really comes down to the dollars. Any questions from the audience? Remember, we're going to keep it civil, which I'm sure it will be, but you can keep it clear to the point. And remember, these are questions, not statements. I've got plenty of experts. So that's great. You want to speak, we'll wait for done and get off. Okay? So if anybody got a question, yes?
I kind of want to go back to what Mr. Borchers was saying at the beginning of the presentation.
There you go. See your trouble now.
About the people in suburban neighborhoods near Detroit having to pick up the tab for these people who are kind of left out in the cold and not able to have water. And I was wondering if you had any ideas about solutions, because obviously these people are going to be upset that they have to pay more, but is there something else that can be done? They don't want to support the corrupt water system.
Well, the number one answer is clean up the corruption and install a regional water authority that actually is professionally managed and is not used to loot and rob. The other thing that I think is important is, and Detroit has stepped up to this, is programs for those who are genuinely of need to make sure that they can have means to help meet those people's needs. Nobody wants truly poor folk to not have water. People aren't heartless. On the other hand, they also recognize over history what has happened, and so they want to understand this. The Regional Water Authority, I think, is a good step forward. Trying to deal with the needs of the poor, certainly is very important. Also trying to clean up the infrastructure, a lot of leakage in the city of Detroit. I mean, you've got abandoned homes that have $20,000 water bills because thieves have taken the pipes out and let the water just run. And so you have real issues with leakage. And running this thing is an efficient operation. If you run the water more efficiently, I think we'd all be better off.
Another question. Just go over here with Stephen, then we'll come back to.
Are we not maybe recognizing or maybe not recognizing politically there's an organizational issue? I think, are the politicians not kind of dodging a bullet here by leaving it to the utilities to take up this issue? Because utilities can only do what they can do with the money that comes in. They don't get tax money. They get paid for water. So they've got a moral obligation too to everybody who's a water user. In other words, are the utilities not getting saddled with it's your social responsibility to give away water, but if they do that, they don't maintain the entire system and they haven't taken care of their social responsibility to everybody or the politicians.
So here's the question. Is the vote, I know this is going to be a shock to the room, but is there a possibility that some politicians are passing the buck? Is that what you're asking?
Yeah, a utility whose mission
and so it's becoming to
a bigger social issue. Theirs is to run a utility.
Indeed, the utility lives with the water problem for 30 years. Politicians have 4-year terms, maybe 8. They'll be long gone before the infrastructure that they failed to provide for,
Doesn't there need to be a solution at a higher level?
And it could, good possible, that's what we want to question, we want to ask ourselves on the way out, does a solution have to be dealt with at the higher levels? And definitely, let's face it, infrastructure is not sexy, right? And so the kind of putting the money into that, the long-term infrastructure work may not be their highest priority. I don't know, but it's interesting. You can always pick on the representative sitting here, Mark. We want to make you do it now, but if someone wants to ask Mark that question, he sits in the General Assembly. You can ask him later. How engaged is the General Assembly looking at water issues? It's an interesting thing.
Yes, I have kind of a totally different question.
I'm not shocked.
It relates to what a lot of you have mentioned is how kind of your faith impacts
let me tell you.
Talk into that for a second.
It's a great question, and thank you. One of the things that, one of the projects I work on is an organization here called Help Through Healing Hands here in Nashville that I serve on the board of. And one of the things we've done is wells in Africa. And the reason behind wanting to do those projects has to do with the quality of health, especially for children and families who do not have access to quality health care. So the wells end up being a very important part of the conversation. Now, if you take that logic and apply it to an inner city that is in the state of blight that you find in a place like Detroit, I guarantee you'll find a correlation that would say that the quality of health for children in those communities that are in rapid deterioration is very much similar to that which is going on in Africa. But when we drill wells in Africa, no one says anything about anybody paying for it who's going to be the direct beneficiary of it. But what is happening is that there are fundraising efforts like the ones you're talking about to pay for those things from the United States. So when is it and how is it that we raise the level of consciousness, that we have a sense of moral responsibility that would allow us to have the same response to what's going on in Africa in access to water as you do for what's going on in a developed community like you find in Detroit? So there is this issue of how the conversation is being advanced and the degree to which we're willing to say that we have some moral responsibility. Because we clearly do it as long as it's the other and it's the they. But it's the us and it's the we. And when we get to where we see it in the same way, the idea of figuring out how you do it at no or low cost ends up being a different issue altogether. So again, I thank you for the question because it does not work out in terms of what seemingly motivates people to want to dig wells in Africa for the reason of caring for the health of the people there, but not being willing to deal with providing water in Detroit for the same reason as caring for the health of the people there, although the health issue is only one dimension of it. So,
yeah. I would also say, I think it's 1.8 million people die every year from lack of clean water. A child dies every 8 seconds from lack of access to clean water. So in one sense, there is a difference between what's happening in Detroit and what's happening in some developing countries around the world where communities have no access to water, and Detroit has plenty of access to water, and it's a very different political issue. I think there is that difference. That being said, I think it is imperative for the church, if not other communities of faith, to treat this issue in an egalitarian sense and look not just at an area that may be sexy in a sense in Africa where we can see images of children who clearly have no access to clean water, but also to look in other parts of the country that may be more developed in this sense in our own backyard and people who don't have that access. So I think it's a great point.
Last comment.
Just a real quick one. About a year ago, I spent some time in Honduras in an area where water wells were going in. And one of the missionaries there, I think wisely, was working with local people to establish a water board that would charge low levels of water rates so that they would have the funds to actually repair the well and keep it operating in a sustained way. Recognizing the fact that water isn't free, it costs something to keep it going. And I think there's a lot of wisdom in that. And hopefully, the only thing I hope they will do that in a way that has egalitarian sense and that doesn't become a water baron that robs from the poor. But recognition is it costs money. It isn't free.
Well, let's thank this group for what Thank you so much. I've learned a lot, and it's been a really wonderful experience for me. You guys have brought a tremendous breadth and depth of experience to this table, and they have come as far as Georgia for free to come up here and engage us. And I want
Nothing's
to
free.
And nothing is free.
Nothing's free. As far as I'm concerned, I'm not paying. So and we appreciate that, and I appreciate you being here. This is the third in a series of discussions about water. It is the beginning of hopefully an annual event from the Institutes of Lipscomb. Next year we will tackle another equally challenging issue. We haven't decided what that would be yet.
but we want you to know that we plan this to be a long-term, continual discussion where the institutes at Lipscomb address the biggest challenges that we face in society and find ways to talk about it civilly, engage it productively, and be gracious in our implementation. Phyllis, would you like to add anything?
Well, Dean Joyner, before you close, Reverend Saunders said something very interesting, and it really raised our very question tonight of whether or not water literacy is a moral human imperative. How fitting that we ask that question here at Lipscomb with our faith commitment and our commitment to education. I want to recognize all of the students in the room. We are so proud of you for coming to Lipscomb. I see faculty from other departments who don't need to be here tonight. There are teachers. Would all the teachers in the room please stand? That includes deans, K-12. The literacy piece. Our new librarian, Sandra Parham, and her colleague, Ms. Hetherington, really graced us with supporting these series of conversations by saying, yes, we can make sure we have the literature you need so that your students can delve deeper, so that the teachers can put these topics on the syllabus. Please check out, Beeman Library came to you this evening. They have a wonderful collection of books around the theme of our water topic, many of which they purchased in the last 2 months in direct response to this conversation. So please, thank the librarian.
Thank you so much for being here. Please continue this conversation. If nothing else if there are no other conversations after these, then we failed. So I hope it has opened your eyes, given you opportunity, introduced you some people who are experts in the field. Please take seriously water and its implications and its impact in the world we live in. Thank you once again. You have a good evening.